August 1940, a demonstration was arranged for Winston Churchill on a field outside London. The weapon on display looked like something from the Middle Ages crossed with a drain pipe. It weighed over 360 pounds. It had no barrel. Instead, a steel rod protruded upward from a heavy base, and a massive bomb, nearly the size of a football, sat waiting to be loaded over it. Everyone present knew Britain had a problem. After Dunkirk, the entire country possessed just 167 anti-tank guns. German panzers could roll across the beaches with almost nothing to stop them, and this primitive-looking catapult was supposed to be the answer. The military establishment had rejected it 3 times. The Ordnance Board wanted nothing to do with it, but Churchill overruled every objection and ordered it into immediate mass production. Within 2 years, over 22,000 of these weapons would be manufactured and placed across Britain. The question was whether any of them could actually destroy a German tank. The answer would prove more complicated than anyone expected, and the real story of this weapon is not about what it could do to tanks. It is about what it accidentally created. 2 weapons that genuinely changed the war. To understand why Britain needed something as desperate as this primitive catapult, you have to understand the scale of the disaster at Dunkirk. Between May 26th and June 4th, 1940, the British Expeditionary Force evacuated from France. They saved the men. They lost almost everything else. 840 anti-tank guns were abandoned on the beaches and in the fields of France. Artillery pieces, vehicles, ammunition stocks, all left behind as the Wehrmacht closed in. When the final counts came in, Britain retained just 167 anti-tank guns to defend the entire country. 167. Germany had thousands of tanks. The mathematics did not work. The situation on the ground was even worse than the numbers suggested. Those surviving guns were scattered across the country, many without adequate ammunition supplies. Trained crews had been killed or captured. Replacement weapons were months away from factory floors. If the Germans launched Operation Sea Lion in the autumn of 1940, British infantry would face panzer divisions with almost nothing capable of stopping them. The Boy's anti-tank rifle, the standard infantry weapon against armor, could penetrate roughly 20 millimeters of steel, but only at dangerously short range. German tanks in 1940 typically carried 30 to 50 millimeters of frontal armor, and that protection was increasing with every new variant. By the time later marks of the Panzer III and IV entered service, frontal armor had thickened to 60 or even 80 millimeters. The Boys was already struggling, and the gap was only getting worse. British infantry had almost nothing that could reliably stop a determined panzer assault. This was not a theoretical problem. In the summer of 1940, German invasion appeared imminent, but one man believed he had the answer, a man who had been working on this problem for 30 years, a man the military establishment had rejected over and over again. His name was Nathan Sterling Blake. Born in 1887, he served in the Indian Army, saw combat in Afghanistan and Turkestan and Russia. He earned his pilot license in 1911 when aviation was barely a decade old. He served as chief observer on the first flight over Mount Everest in 1933. After retiring as a major in 1932, he did something unusual. He privately funded his own weapons research, spending his own money to develop concepts the military had rejected. His concept was the spigot mortar. Unlike conventional mortars, where a projectile drops into a tube and fires out the open end, Blake inverted the entire arrangement. A fixed steel rod, the spigot protruded upward from the base. The bomb, with a hollow tail containing propellant, slid down over this rod until it rested on a firing mechanism. When triggered, a firing pin running through the length of the spigot struck a primer inside the bomb, igniting 270 grains of cordite and blasting the projectile into the air. The advantage was manufacturing simplicity. Conventional artillery required precision machined barrels, the most expensive and time-consuming component of any gun. A barrel must be bored to exact tolerances, rifled with absolute precision, and heat-treated to withstand repeated firing. The spigot design eliminated this entirely. The rod was simple steel, easy to manufacture in any machine shop. The bombs could theoretically be any diameter, limited only by the propellant charge. Production could be scaled rapidly using basic industrial equipment that was not already committed to aircraft or tank manufacture. The military establishment hated it. The Ordnance Board had rejected the spigot mortar concept in 1910 when it was first proposed by another inventor. They rejected Blake's patent application in 1930. They rejected it again in 1939 when Major Mitchell Jefferson submitted it through military intelligence research. A senior Ordnance Board member reportedly declared that even if God Almighty himself sponsored the spigot mortar, it would still be turned down by the Ordnance Board. The rejection was not entirely unreasonable. Spigot mortars had genuine drawbacks. Without rifling accuracy depended entirely on the quality of the mounting and the consistency of the propellant charge. The projectile followed a high arcing trajectory that made engaging moving targets extremely difficult, and the entire concept seemed to professional artillery officers fundamentally amateurish, but Blake refused to give up. He mortgaged his London townhouse to fund continued research. His wife Margaret watched their savings disappear into failed prototypes and rejected patent applications. His 15-year-old daughter Catherine gave up plans for university because the money was gone. His 12-year-old son David wrote a school essay that began, "My father invents weapons that don't work." By February 1940, the Blake family was in crisis. The mortgage was 3 months overdue. Margaret confronted Nathan in his workshop one evening. "Nathan, we need to talk about this mortgage." He did not look up from his drafting table. "I am close, Margaret. The principle is sound. I just need to refine the mounting mechanism." "You have been close for 20 years. Her voice was steady, but Blake heard the exhaustion in it. "Our children are suffering. Catherine may not be able to attend university. David is embarrassed to bring friends home. This will work. I know it will work. The Ordnance Board does not agree." Blake finally looked up at his wife. His eyes were red from lack of sleep. "The Ordnance Board is wrong. They are wedded to conventional thinking. When the next war comes, and it will come soon, Britain will need weapons that can be manufactured quickly. They will need my design." Margaret studied her husband's face. She saw the desperation there, the absolute conviction, the stubborn pride that had defined their marriage for 20 years. "And if you are wrong, what then?" Blake had no answer. 3 months later, Dunkirk happened, and suddenly Nathan Sterling Blake's rejected weapon did not seem quite so impossible anymore. Then came Dunkirk, and suddenly unconventional solutions looked a lot more attractive. Blake was introduced to military intelligence research, later designated MD1 and nicknamed Churchill's Toy Shop. This was a secret weapons development unit operating outside normal military channels, answerable directly to the Prime Minister. They developed sabotage devices, booby traps, and irregular weapons that the orthodox military establishment would never approve. Major Jefferson, head of the unit, saw potential in the spigot design and sent Blake to Coates Castle to develop a working prototype. Blake had 6 weeks. 6 weeks to prove that 30 years of obsession was not madness. 6 weeks to create something that could convince Churchill his impossible dream was worth betting Britain's survival on. He worked 18-hour days. The design was already in his head, refined through years of rejection and revision. Now he just needed to build it. The 29mm designation referred to the diameter of the steel spigot rod, not the projectile size. The actual bomb measured 6 inches across, 152 millimeters. This was a substantial weapon system. The launcher alone weighed 112 pounds. With the cruciform mounting required for stable operation, total weight reached 360 to 407 pounds. Moving it required 5 or 6 men carrying the launcher, the mount, ammunition, and tools. The anti-tank bomb weighed 19.5 pounds and contained 8.75 pounds of Nobel's number 808 explosive in a hollow charge configuration. Maximum range was 450 yards. But here is where the problems began. Effective range was just 75 to 100 yards, and muzzle velocity was only 245 feet per second, roughly 75 meters per second. For comparison, the boy's anti-tank rifle achieved 2,450 to 2,900 feet per second. A professional fast bowler in cricket delivers the ball at around 90 miles per hour, approximately 130 feet per second. Blake's projectile was barely twice that speed. This created serious problems for practical use. But Blake told himself that shaped charge warheads do not actually require high velocity to work. The armor-piercing jet forms from the explosive detonation and liner geometry, not impact speed. He was right about that, but he was wrong about many other things he would not discover until much later. On August 18, 1940, Winston Churchill personally attended a demonstration. The director of artillery objected, government officials objected. Churchill overruled them all. As Prime Minister, Minister of Defense, and First Lord of the Treasury, he controlled both military channels and Treasury funding. The weapon that had been rejected for 30 years was about to get one final chance. Blake stood beside his prototype on that August morning. The weapon looked absurd in the sunlight. A medieval siege engine crossed with a drain pipe, a steel rod protruding upward from a heavy base. A massive bomb the size of a football waiting to be loaded. Churchill stepped forward. "Show me what this contraption can do, Lieutenant Colonel Blake." Blake's crew loaded the bomb over the spigot. They retreated to the firing position. Blake pulled the firing lanyard. The cordite charge ignited with a dull thump. The bomb arced into the air, spinning slightly as it flew. It struck a wooden target structure at approximately 100 yards, detonating with a satisfying explosion. Smoke and splinters filled the air. When it cleared, the target structure was demolished. Churchill watched in silence. Then he turned to the director of artillery. "Your assessment, Prime Minister, this weapon is crude, inaccurate, and completely unproven. I cannot recommend it for military service." Churchill's expression did not change. "That was not what I asked. I asked for your assessment of what I just saw." The director hesitated. "The weapon can launch a projectile." Whether it can reliably destroy German armor is highly questionable. Churchill turned back to Blake. Can it destroy a German tank? This was the moment of truth. Blake could lie, claim capabilities he was not certain his weapon possessed. Or he could be honest. Sir, it has a chance. At close range with a direct hit, the shaped charge might penetrate side armor, but I cannot guarantee it will work as reliably as conventional anti-tank guns. Conventional anti-tank guns we do not have. Churchill was silent for a long moment. Behind him, the director of artillery prepared to object again, but Churchill raised his hand. Gentlemen, our situation is simple. We have 167 anti-tank guns to defend Britain. The Germans have thousands of tanks gathering across the Channel. Lieutenant Colonel Blake's weapon might not be perfect, it might not even be good, but it is something, and something is infinitely better than nothing. He looked directly at Blake. You have your approval, 22,000 units, immediate production priority. The production order was signed August 20th, 1940. Nathan Sterling Blake's 30-year obsession had just been validated by the Prime Minister of England. The weapon that had been rejected 3 times was now going into mass production. Blake should have felt triumph, relief, vindication. Instead, he felt a hollow uncertainty he could not quite name. That evening, he met Margaret at home. She had heard the news through military channels. Catherine and David were in the parlor listening to the radio reports about the continuing Battle of Britain. They approved it, Blake spoke quietly. 22,000 units. Margaret studied her husband's face. After 20 years of marriage, she knew him better than anyone. You do not look happy, Nathan. I am uncertain. Churchill asked me directly if it could destroy a German tank. I told him it had a chance. That was honest. But I do not know if it is enough. The Prime Minister seems to think it is. The Prime Minister is desperate. We all are. Blake walked to the window and looked out over London. Somewhere in the darkness, air raid sirens were beginning their nightly wail. What if I am sending men into battle with a weapon that will fail them? Margaret came to stand beside him. You have spent 30 years trying to give Britain this weapon. The military finally listened. You cannot doubt yourself now. But Blake did doubt, not the principle. The spigot design was sound, but the implementation, the fusing, the accuracy, the shaped charge effectiveness, all of that was still uncertain. He had just committed Britain to manufacturing 22,000 weapons that might not work when soldiers needed them most. Upstairs, Catherine listened to her parents' voices through the floor. She was old enough now to understand what was happening, old enough to hear the doubt in her father's voice, old enough to wonder if her family's suffering had been for nothing. By September 1941, the first allocation of 1,430 weapons went to Southern Command. Orders escalated to 16,000, then 28,000. By September 1942, Home Guard inventory peaked at 17,954 bombards. Ammunition production reached approximately 1.4 million anti-tank rounds and 729,000 anti-personnel rounds. The allocation scales revealed the intended deployment density: 24 weapons per anti-tank regiment, 12 per aerodrome defense unit, 8 per brigade, 2 per Home Guard company. Royal Engineers precast concrete pedestals and placed them at strategic locations across southern England. Thousands of these fixed positions were installed along predicted invasion routes. Each mortar was allocated 4 mounting positions for alternative firing locations. Blake visited a manufacturing facility in October 1941. Margaret accompanied him. They stood in a warehouse watching workers assemble weapons by the hundreds: steel rods, heavy bases, cruciform mounts, bombs by the thousands. The scale of production was staggering. Everything Blake had dreamed of for 30 years was happening. His design, his principle, being manufactured by the thousands. This is what you worked for, Nathan. Margaret spoke quietly. All those years, all that sacrifice. Look at what you have created. Blake watched a worker test fit a bomb onto a spigot. The operation was simple, crude, but it worked. Are you certain these will work? Margaret's question hung in the air. Blake thought about the testing he had done, the 50 to 60% hit probability at 100 yards under optimal conditions, the unreliable fusing, the inconsistent penetration when they tested against armor plate. I hope so. His voice was barely audible. I truly hope so. That by late 1941, the Blacker bombards were being distributed to Home Guard units across southern England. But contemporary users knew something was wrong. Lieutenant Colonel Herbert of the 3rd Battalion Wiltshire Home Guard received his unit's allocation in November 1941. He read the technical manual carefully, calculated the engagement parameters, realized immediately what no one had wanted to admit. The weapon was apparently only for use against moving targets up to 75 to 100 yards. He described this as charming for the Home Guard, who have to load it from the front in full view of the enemy 100 yards away. Think about that for a moment. The crew had to approach the weapon from the forward arc, place the 19.5-pound bomb over the spigot, insert the firing pin, retreat to the firing position, all of this at 75 to 100 yards from German tanks. A German MG-34 machine gun had an effective range of over 1,000 yards, rate of fire 800 to 900 rounds per minute. The mathematics were brutal. Any crew attempting to load this weapon within range of German infantry would likely be dead before the bomb launched. Herbert wrote a formal letter to command. He declared that 50 of these weapons were being issued to his battalion, but he had no possible use for them. They would merely add to the dumps of scrap iron already lying about in Wiltshire villages. HQ Salisbury Plain District formally reported the weapon as highly unpopular. Some units attempted to trade their bombards for Thompson submachine guns, preferring close-quarters firepower over a dubious anti-tank capability. RAF personnel were explicitly forbidden from handling it. That restriction alone suggested what command really thought about the weapon's reliability. By November 1941, barely weeks after mass distribution began, official concerns emerged about suitability. Issues ceased in Southern Command by July 1942, giving the weapon roughly 8 months of active deployment priority. 8 months after 30 years of development, after 22,000 units manufactured, after concrete pedestals installed across southern England. 8 months. Then came the accident that Blake had feared since the day Churchill approved his weapon, November 19th, 1941. Tewkesbury Home Guard, indoor practice at Healing's Mill. Sergeant Arthur Hanlon was conducting a loading drill. The bomb detonated during the procedure. 3 men were injured. Hanlon was killed instantly. The investigation revealed what Blake had suspected. The fusing was unreliable, too sensitive in some conditions, not sensitive enough in others. The fragments from the bomb's casing were thrown back toward the crew position, creating a danger zone that extended 25 yards behind the firing point. When Blake heard the news, he was in his workshop at home. Jefferson called him personally to deliver the report. Blake set down the telephone. His hands were shaking. Margaret found him sitting at his drafting table an hour later. He had not moved. The accident report lay open in front of him. Nathan. He looked up at his wife. His face was ashen. I killed him, Margaret. Sergeant Arthur Hanlon, 42 years old. Wife and 3 children. I killed him with a weapon designed to kill Germans. You did not kill him. It was an accident. An accident caused by unreliable fusing on a weapon I designed, a weapon I convinced Churchill to approve, a weapon I knew had problems but told myself would work anyway. Margaret knelt beside her husband's chair. Accidents happen in wartime. Training accidents happen. You cannot blame yourself for this. Who else should I blame? The Ordnance Board was right. They rejected this design 3 times. They knew it was flawed, and I was too proud, too stubborn, too obsessed to listen. He picked up the accident report with trembling hands. Hanlon's widow received a telegram. Your husband was killed in training, not in combat, not defending Britain, in training, because I could not admit my weapon was not good enough. Blake stood, abruptly walked to the workshop shelves where 30 years of rejected designs and failed prototypes gathered dust. Perhaps this was all madness. Perhaps I wasted my life on an impossible dream. Perhaps the Ordnance Board was right, and I was simply an arrogant fool who bankrupted his family and killed British soldiers with weapons that should never have been built. Margaret had no answer. She watched her husband's shoulders shake with silent grief. Upstairs, Catherine heard her father's anguished voice through the floor. She turned to her younger brother, David. Papa's weapon killed someone. David was 13 now, old enough to understand the weight of those words. Will they stop making them? Catherine did not know. Blake's despair deepened through the winter of 1941, but even as guilt consumed him, he had been working on something else, a solution to the Bombard's mobility problem. Before Hanlon's death, Blake had developed a portable version, a weapon a single soldier could carry. He called it the Baby Bombard. The concept was the same spigot principle, but scaled down dramatically. 35 pounds instead of 360, shoulder fired instead of crew served, something that could be carried into battle and used by infantry without fixed positions. In June 1941, Blake had submitted the Baby Bombard for trials. He attended the test, firing himself hopeful that this smaller version would prove more practical than the full-size weapon. The results were catastrophic. The casing was too flimsy. It buckled under propellant pressure. The spigot mechanism jammed after 3 shots. Accuracy was abysmal, worse even than the full-size Bombard, and the range was insufficient for crew safety. During the final test, the prototype injured the operator. Minor burns to his hands. No fatality, but enough to make everyone step back from the weapon. The military rejected it immediately. Blake's second major failure in a year. He filed the designs away and tried to forget about them. Another dead end, another wasted effort. More proof that perhaps the Ordnance Board had been right about him all along. Jefferson had been at those trials. He watched the Baby Bombard fail, watched Blake's face as the rejection came through, saw something in the design that Blake, consumed by his sense of failure, could not see, but Jefferson said nothing at the time. He simply made a note in his files and waited. By the end of 1941, the Bombard program continued, despite growing doubts. Production proceeded, distribution continued, training went on more carefully now after Hanlon's death. The concrete pedestals stood along country roads and canal paths across southern England. Empty or occupied, they represented Britain's desperate gamble, monuments to unconventional thinking, to weapons that might not work but were better than nothing. Blake visited one of these positions in December 1941. It overlooked the English Channel from a hillside in Sussex. On clear days, you could see France from here, see the coastline where German invasion barges had gathered 18 months earlier. A bombard sat mounted on the pedestal, bomb beside it, ready to fire at tanks that might never come. Blake stood there for a long time looking out over the water. This is what 30 years had produced. Weapons of questionable effectiveness, a dead soldier, a family nearly destroyed by debt and obsession, and concrete platforms waiting for a battle that might end with British crews dead before they could fire a shot. The wind off the channel was cold. Blake pulled his coat tighter. He thought about Churchill's question on that August morning, can it destroy a German tank? Blake had answered honestly, it has a chance, but chances are not certainties. And Hanlon had died not facing German armor, but in a training hall in Tewkesbury. Blake turned away from the channel and walked back to his car. Behind him, the concrete pedestal stood ready. The bombard pointed skyward, waiting for tanks, waiting for war, waiting to prove whether Nathan Sterling Blake was a visionary or a fool. But here is what Nathan Sterling Blake did not know as he drove away from that hilltop in December 1941. He did not know that Major Mitchell Jefferson had quietly retrieved the failed baby bombard prototype from storage. He did not know that Jefferson was planning to take the weapon apart piece by piece and rebuild it from scratch. He did not know that his spigot principle, rejected 3 times by the Ordnance Board, was about to become the foundation for weapons that would genuinely change the war. He did not know that his failures were about to enable successes beyond anything he imagined. All Blake knew in December 1941 was that his weapon had failed to prove itself. His family had suffered, a soldier had died, and he could not see any path forward that would make 30 years of obsession worthwhile. Sometimes the answer to a question is not yes or no. Sometimes the answer is you are asking the wrong question. Could the Blacker bombard destroy a German tank? Maybe. Sometimes, under perfect conditions, but that was never the right question. The right question was, could a failed weapon create the technology that would save thousands of lives? That question would not be answered for another 3 years. But when it was, the answer would vindicate Nathan Sterling Blake in ways he never expected. And it would start with a man taking apart a rejected prototype on his office floor, January 1942. Home Guard units across southern England were receiving their Blacker bombards and beginning training exercises. The official training manual made it sound simple. Load the bomb over the spigot, insert the firing pin, aim using the simple sights, fire. The shaped charge would do the rest. But the men who had to use these weapons saw problems immediately. These were not inexperienced civilians fumbling with unfamiliar equipment. The average Home Guard age was 35 years. 40% had served in World War I. They had seen combat. They understood weapons. They knew what worked and what did not, and they knew this weapon did not work. The loading procedure was the first problem. The bomb weighed 19.5 pounds. The crew had to approach from the front lift, this weight over the spigot, ensure proper seating, insert the firing pin through a small hole, then retreat to the firing position. Under training conditions with no enemy fire, this took 30 to 45 seconds. Under combat conditions with German machine guns firing, tanks, advancing artillery falling, how long would it take? More importantly, how many crew members would survive long enough to complete the procedure? Lieutenant David Morrison of the Sussex Home Guard conducted timed exercises with his men in February 1942. His unit had received 12 bombards. He had them practice loading drills repeatedly. His report to command was blunt. At the effective range of 75 to 100 yards, any crew attempting to load this weapon in view of German infantry would be dead before the bomb launched. The German MG-34 machine gun could deliver 800 rounds per minute at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. Simple mathematics, the crew would be cut down during the loading sequence. Morrison's recommendation, the weapon should only be employed from heavily fortified positions with overhead cover, limiting fields of fire to such an extent that its tactical utility becomes negligible. Translation, the weapon was useless. But the reports kept coming, unit after unit, the same problems, the same conclusions. HQ, Salisbury Plain District, received so many negative assessments they stopped forwarding them up the chain of command. By March 1942, some Home Guard units were trying to trade their bombards for anything else, Thompson submachine guns, extra rifles, even hand grenades, and close quarters weapons they could actually use. One unit in Kent buried 3 of their bombards in the concrete pedestals and reported them lost during transport. No one investigated too closely. Command knew what the report really meant. Thomas Room, a Home Guard corporal, later described the bombard in an Imperial War Museum oral history. We called it the suicide stick, not because it would kill Germans, because it would get you killed trying to use it. The joke was that if the Germans saw us setting one up, they would die laughing before we could fire. But behind the dark humor was genuine concern. These men had volunteered to defend Britain. They were prepared to die if necessary, but they wanted weapons that gave them a fighting chance. The bombard did not. RAF personnel were explicitly forbidden from handling the weapon. That order came from high command. No explanation given, none needed. When the military tells its own personnel not to touch a weapon, that weapon has failed. Testing continued throughout early 1942. The results were consistently disappointing. At Bisley in April 1941, hit probability had reached 50 to 60% at 100 yards under optimal conditions. Fixed target, prepared position, clear line of sight, no return fire, perfect weather. But combat provides none of those conditions. Against a moving target, hit probability dropped to perhaps 20%, maybe less, and hitting a tank was not the same as destroying it. The shaped charge warhead was early generation technology. The standoff distance was inconsistent. When the bomb approached on a high arcing trajectory, the fusing remained unreliable. Weapons historian Ian Hogg later assessed the Blacker Bombard could inflict significant damage on a tank, but was unlikely to actually pierce the vehicle's armor. Significant damage meant track damage, destroyed road wheels, smashed periscopes, wounded crew from concussion, a mobility kill perhaps, but reliably destroy a Panzer III or IV. That was asking too much from this primitive catapult. The men assigned to use it knew this, their commanders knew it, and by spring 1942 even Churchill knew it, but 22,000 weapons had been manufactured, concrete pedestals installed across England, millions of rounds of ammunition produced. The program could not simply be cancelled. That would be admitting defeat, admitting waste, admitting that Churchill's gamble had failed, so the weapons remained in place, training continued, and everyone pretended the emperor was wearing clothes. Nathan Sterling Blake spent the spring of 1942 in quiet despair. The reports from the field reached him through Jefferson. Each one was another nail in the coffin of his 30-year dream. Weapon highly unpopular. Crews refused to train with it. Tactical utility negligible. Recommend immediate withdrawal from service. And then in late March came news that broke something inside him, a second training fatality. Private James Wheeler, Home Guard Cornwall, killed when a bomb detonated prematurely during a loading drill. 2 others wounded. The investigation revealed the same fusing problems that had killed Sergeant Hanlon 4 months earlier. Blake received the report on a Tuesday afternoon. He read it once, set it down, walked to his workshop, closed the door. Margaret found him there. 3 hours later, he was sitting in the dark, surrounded by 30 years of rejected designs and failed prototypes. Nathan, he did not respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. 2 men, 2 British soldiers, dead because of weapons I designed, not killed by Germans, killed by my failures. Margaret came to sit beside him. The military approved your design. They conducted their own testing. The responsibility is not yours alone. I knew the fusing was unreliable. I knew it and said nothing. I told myself it would work because I needed it to work, because I had spent 30 years on this obsession and could not admit it was all for nothing. He looked at his wife in the darkness. The Ordnance Board was right, Margaret. They rejected this design 3 times. They knew it was flawed, and I was too arrogant to listen. Margaret had no answer. She simply held her husband's hand in the darkness while he wept for men he had never met but had somehow killed. Upstairs, Catherine listened to her father's anguished sobs through the floor. She was 16 now, old enough to understand the weight of guilt, old enough to see her father breaking under it. She turned to David. Will Papa ever forgive himself? David, now 13, shook his head. I don't think so. But while Blake descended into guilt and self-recrimination, he did not know that Major Mitchell Jefferson was working on something that might redeem everything. In September 1941, after Blake had been quietly reassigned to other duties, Jefferson made a request through official channels. He wanted Blake's failed baby bombard prototype and all the associated design documents. The official reason was documentation, learning from failures for future projects. The real reason was that Jefferson thought he could fix it. Jefferson had combat engineering background. He understood field requirements in ways Blake, for all his brilliance, did not. Jefferson thought like a soldier who would have to carry this weapon into battle. He took the baby bombard prototype to his MD1 office in late September 1941, spread the components across his floor, and began the most important work of his career. From September through January, Jefferson worked on the redesign every spare moment, evenings, weekends, hours that should have been spent sleeping. The problems were clear. First, the spigot mechanism. Blake's design was too delicate. Too many moving parts, too prone to failure. Jefferson simplified it, reduced moving parts from 23 to 11, increased reliability from 60% to over 95%. Second, the casing. Blake had used sheet metal to minimize weight, but it could not withstand the propellant pressure. Jefferson switched to steel tube construction, heavier, yes. Weight increased from 35 pounds to 33 pounds, roughly 15 kilograms, but the system could withstand the pressure without buckling. Third, the firing mechanism. Blake's shoulder-fired design created unbearable recoil. The shooter would be knocked backward, possibly injured, definitely unable to maintain aim. Jefferson created something different. The weapon rested on the ground. The operator braced it with his feet, then used his entire body weight to haul back a powerful spring. When released, the spring drove the firing pin forward. Awkward, yes, but manageable. And more importantly, it worked. Fourth, the shaped charge. Blake had used early generation hollow charge technology. The geometry was wrong, the standoff distance inadequate, the penetration disappointing. Jefferson collaborated with explosives experts at MD1. They refined the charge geometry, improved the standoff mechanism, increased penetration from 50 millimeters, theoretical, to 75 to 100 millimeters, proven. December 10th, 1941, Jefferson arranged a test firing of his redesigned prototype. The target was a section of captured German Panzer III frontal armor, 50 millimeters thick, hardened steel. The same armor British infantry would face if they ever had to engage German tanks at close range. Range 100 yards, Jefferson loaded the weapon himself, placed it on the ground, braced it with his feet, hauled back the spring with his entire body weight, aimed carefully at the armor plate, released. The weapon fired with a sharp crack. The projectile flew in a flat trajectory much flatter than the bombard's high arc. It struck the armor plate dead center. The shaped charge detonated. When the smoke cleared, Jefferson walked to the target. The armor plate had a hole punched completely through it, clean penetration, the kind of damage that would kill a tank crew instantly. Jefferson's hands were shaking as he wrote his notes. The principle works. Blake was right about spigot design. He was wrong about everything else. But this was not just about proving Blake right or wrong. This was about giving British infantry something they desperately needed, a weapon they could carry, a weapon they could use, a weapon that could actually kill German tanks. Jefferson called it the Jeffers shoulder gun initially, but that name would not last. It would be changed to something more official. Projector Infantry Anti-Tank, PIAT, the first official British infantry weapon using hollow charge anti-tank technology. And it used Nathan Sterling Blake's rejected spigot principle as its foundation. February 1942, Jefferson requested that Blake return to MD1 for a meeting. Blake had not been to the office since his removal 4 months earlier. He assumed this was a formality, perhaps final closure on the Bombard program, perhaps reassignment to some administrative role where he could do no more damage. He entered Jefferson's office expecting nothing. Jefferson gestured to a table where a weapon lay disassembled. "Do you recognize this?" Blake looked closer. The components were familiar, his baby Bombard, but modified, strengthened, refined. "You kept working on it. I rebuilt it. Your spigot principle was sound. Your implementation needed work. I made it work." Jefferson showed Blake the test results, the armor penetration, the reliability improvements, the production specifications. This will be designated the PIAT, Projector Infantry Anti-Tank. Initial production order is 5,000 units. That number will increase to over 100,000 by war's end. Blake stared at the weapon, his principle. Jefferson's execution, success built on his failure. He should have felt pride, vindication, relief. Instead, he felt diminished. "You succeeded where I failed." Jefferson looked at his colleague carefully. "I built on your foundation. The spigot principle is yours. Without that, none of this works. You created the breakthrough. I just made it practical. History will remember your modifications, not my principle. History remembers what works. This works, and it works because of your idea." Blake picked up one of the redesigned components, turned it over in his hands. "I spent 30 years on this obsession, bankrupted my family, got soldiers killed with inadequate weapons, and you fixed it in 4 months. I had the advantage of seeing what did not work. You had to create the concept from nothing." Those are different kinds of genius, but Blake was not listening. All he could think was that his life's work had been reduced to a footnote. The spigot principle, invented by Nathan Sterling Blake, implemented successfully by Mitchell Jefferson, the visionary who could not execute, the engineer whose weapons failed until someone else fixed them. That would be his legacy. But Blake did not know that his contributions were not finished, that another weapon bearing his principle was about to change naval warfare. Before the Bombard consumed his attention in 1940, Blake had submitted a third concept, an anti-submarine weapon using the spigot principle. The problem with conventional depth charges was simple. They dropped from a ship's stern, detonated at preset depths. By the time the ship reached the drop point, the submarine had moved. The attacking ship lost sonar contact during the approach. And the depth charges detonated regardless of whether they hit anything, revealing the ship's position and wasting ordnance. Blake's solution was elegant, Forward-throwing projectiles, multiple spigot launchers arranged in a pattern on the foredeck, fire ahead of the ship while maintaining sonar contact. Pattern coverage increases hit probability, and critically, the projectiles only detonated on direct contact with the submarine hull. No hit meant no detonation. The attacking ship could maintain sonar contact throughout the entire engagement. The Admiralty had rejected the concept in 1940, too complex, unproven technology, expensive modifications to existing vessels. Blake filed the paperwork and moved on to other projects. He never returned to the idea, just another rejection in a career filled with them. But in the autumn of 1941, as the Battle of the Atlantic reached crisis levels, someone at the Admiralty remembered Blake's rejected proposal. German U-boats were sinking merchant shipping faster than replacement construction. Convoy losses were unsustainable. Britain was slowly being strangled. Conventional depth charges were not working well enough. The Admiralty needed something better. They located Blake's paperwork, reviewed the concept, saw potential. Development began on what would be called Hedgehog, named for the pattern of projectiles, 24 spigots arranged like hedgehog spines. Each projectile was 7 inches in diameter, weighed 65 pounds, contained 35 pounds of Torpex explosive, forward throw distance 250 yards, pattern spread 100 feet diameter, and the critical advantage contact fuses, only exploded on direct hit. Testing through the winter of 1941 and 1942 showed dramatic improvements over conventional depth charges. HMS Westcott received the first installation in early 1942. Trial attacks against practice submarines showed success rates far exceeding depth charge attacks. Production was authorized in February 1942. The same month as the PIAT, 2 weapons, both using Nathan Sterling Blake's spigot principle, both entering mass production, both about to change the war, and Blake knew about neither of them yet. May 1942. Blake received an official letter from the Treasury. The Royal Commission on Awards to Inventors was reviewing his case. 3 weapons had been derived from his spigot principle, the Blacker Bombard, the Piat, the Hedgehog. 1 had failed, 2 were succeeding. The question was how to calculate Blake's contribution. Blake read the letter with mixed emotions. Financial compensation would solve his family's money problems. The mortgage could be paid, Catherine's university secured, David's school fees covered, but money could not erase guilt, could not bring back Hanlon and Wheeler, could not change the fact that Jefferson had succeeded where he had failed. The commission hearing was held in June 1942. Blake testified. Jefferson testified, crediting Blake's principle as the foundation for Piat's success. Naval engineers testified that Hedgehog's core concept came from Blake's 1940 proposal. Jefferson made a point of emphasizing Blake's contribution. Without Lieutenant Colonel Blake's spigot principle, neither weapon would exist. The PIAT is not my invention. It is Blake's concept refined for practical use. The distinction matters. Refinement is incremental. The breakthrough was his. The naval engineers agreed. We improved Blake's anti-submarine concept, but the forward-throwing pattern, contact fusing, and spigot launch mechanism were all in his original proposal. Our work was optimization, not innovation. In August 1942, the commission announced its decision. Nathan Sterling Blake would receive £75,000, equivalent to approximately £3.5 million in modern currency. Compensation for his contributions to the Bombard Piat Hedgehog and Petard Spigot mortar, mounted on Churchill AVRE tanks. Recognition as the original inventor. Acknowledgement that others had improved his implementations, but the core concept was his. Blake received the news at home. Margaret cried. Catherine hugged her father. David finally smiled at his father for the first time in months. The mortgage was paid off within a week. University plans restored. Financial terror ended. But that night, Blake sat alone in his workshop, surrounded by rejected designs, successful weapons, compensation letters, and he felt hollow. Blake wrote in his journal on August 30th, 1942, I have achieved everything I sought, recognition, validation, financial security, yet I feel empty. The weapons bearing my principle will save lives, but they are no longer mine. Jefferson improved PYAT beyond my capability. Hedgehog succeeded without my direct involvement. I am the architect whose buildings were redesigned by better engineers. History will record my name but question my competence. Perhaps that is deserved. 2 men died because of my inadequate designs. The Bombard failed completely. I succeeded only by failing first, providing cautionary examples for better engineers to learn from. Margaret says I should be proud that creating the principle is enough, that not every inventor sees their work through to completion. But pride requires ownership, and I no longer own these successes. I simply pointed the direction. Others walked the path. The commission called me the original inventor, but what value is originality without execution? What worth is vision without practical achievement? I have been paid handsomely for my failures. That is the deepest irony of all. Blake closed his journal, looked around his workshop one final time that night. Tomorrow he would accept his commission payment, restore his family's finances. provide the security they deserved after years of suffering. But tonight he sat alone with his failures, with the ghosts of Hanlon and Wheeler, with the knowledge that his life's work had been reduced to a foundation for other men's achievements, the spigot principle invented by Nathan Sterling Blake, made practical by Mitchell Jefferson, implemented successfully by Royal Navy engineers. That would be his legacy, the man who had the idea but could not make it work. What Blake could not know in the summer of 1942 was that the weapons he considered no longer his were about to face their ultimate test in the hedgerows of Normandy, in the ruins of Arnhem, in the dark waters of the Atlantic. His principle would prove itself in ways he never imagined, and men would survive because of ideas he thought were failures. Jefferson understood this. He tried to explain it to Blake during their February meeting, but Blake could not hear it through his guilt and sense of inadequacy. "You gave us the breakthrough," Jefferson had said. "Everything after that is just engineering. Breakthroughs are rare. Engineering is common. You did the hard part." But Blake saw it differently. He saw his weapons failing while others succeeded. He saw his implementations being replaced while his principle was retained. He saw recognition that felt like consolation. The truth was more complicated than Blake understood. Innovation rarely happens in a straight line from vision to implementation. Most breakthroughs require multiple people: the visionary who sees what is possible, the implementer who makes it practical, the refiners who perfect the details. All necessary, none sufficient alone. Blake was the visionary. Jefferson was the implementer. The naval engineers were the refiners. All three roles mattered. All three saved lives. But Blake, consumed by guilt over Hanlon, and Wheeler could only see his failures, could not yet see how those failures had enabled victories. That understanding would come later. In 1945, when the war ended and the final accounting could be made. For now, in the summer of 1942, he could only wait and hope that somehow his 30 years of obsession would prove to have been worth the cost. 1943. The Piat began reaching frontline British and Commonwealth infantry battalions. Production had ramped up quickly. 5,000 units by mid-1943, 20,000 by early 1944. The number would eventually reach 115,000 by war's end. Training emphasized close-range engagement, ambush tactics, urban warfare, the awkward operation bracing the weapon with your feet and hauling back the spring with your entire body weight became an accepted trade-off for genuine armor penetration capability. Early combat reports from North Africa and Italy were mixed. Effective at close range, yes. Under 100 yards, the Piat could penetrate the side armor of Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks reliably, but frontal armor engagements remained risky. The shaped charge simply did not have enough penetration for the thickest armor. The reload time was slow, 10 to 15 seconds. That made crews vulnerable. Fire once the tank knows your position. 15 seconds to reload while machine guns traverse toward you. Many PIAT crews never got off a second shot. But critically, British infantry finally had something that could kill tanks without needing artillery support or their own armor. For the first time since Dunkirk, infantrymen facing German panzers had a genuine fighting chance. German intelligence took notice. A captured German tactical report from October 1943, discovered after the war, described the new British weapon. British infantry now equipped with shoulder-fired anti-armor weapon. Crude appearance but effective penetration at close range. Panzer commanders advised to maintain distance from British positions. Avoid urban environments where weapon can be employed from ambush, designated Panzerbuchse 43 in intelligence reports. The Germans respected it enough to change their tactics around it, but the real test was still to come, the ultimate proof of whether Blake's principle could work in the most desperate combat imaginable. That test would happen in September 1944 in a Dutch city called Arnhem. Major Robert Hayes Coleman was 35 years old in September 1944. He had enlisted in 1929, seen combat in North Africa, fought through Sicily, led men through some of the hardest fighting of the war. He was known for aggressive leadership and a refusal to accept defeat. His unit, the South Staffordshire Regiment, was part of the British 1st Airborne Division. On September 17, 1944, they parachuted into Arnhem, Netherlands as part of Operation Market Garden. The plan was ambitious: seize the bridge over the Rhine River, hold it until ground forces arrived, open the way into Germany. Intelligence said German resistance would be light, scattered remnants, nothing organized, nothing the airborne forces could not handle. Intelligence was catastrophically wrong. 2 SS Panzer divisions were refitting near Arnhem. Thousands of experienced troops, dozens of tanks, professional soldiers who knew how to fight. The lightly armed British airborne troops suddenly faced an armored counterattack they were not prepared for. The Piat became their primary anti-tank defense. Coleman's unit landed on September 17th and moved toward the bridge. By September 19th, German armor was probing their perimeter. Tiger tanks, Panzer IVs, self-propelled guns. The British positions were surrounded, cut off, running low on ammunition, facing overwhelming odds. And Coleman personally took charge of a Piat team. September 19th morning, a Tiger tank advanced down Utrechtse Straat toward Coleman's position. The Tiger was the heaviest tank Germany fielded in 1944, 88mm main gun, frontal armor up to 120 millimeters thick, nearly impervious to most Allied anti-tank weapons. The Piat could not penetrate Tiger frontal armor. Coleman knew that, but he also knew the Tiger had to expose its flanks when it turned at the street corner ahead. He positioned his Piat team in a building overlooking the intersection. Second floor window, clear field of fire. Range would be about 50 yards when the tank turned. The Tiger approached slowly. Cautiously, the commander knew British forces were in the area. Machine gun fire swept the buildings. Infantry followed behind the tank, using it for cover. Coleman waited, his hands steady on the PIAT. The weapon was loaded, spring under tension. He had one shot before the Germans identified his position. The Tiger reached the corner, began its turn, the side armor exposed. Coleman fired. The projectile struck the Tiger's side at the turret ring. The shaped charge detonated. The armor-piercing jet burned through the steel. The Tiger stopped moving. Smoke began pouring from the engine deck. Hatches flew open. The crew abandoned the vehicle and ran. Coleman's team reloaded 15 seconds. German infantry was returning fire now. Bullets snapped through the window, but they got the second shot off, hitting the abandoned Tiger again to ensure it was disabled. Mobility kill. The Tiger would not threaten anyone else that day. Coleman moved his team to a different position before German artillery could range their location. Behind him, the Tiger burned. Over the next 9 days, Coleman would repeat variations of that engagement 6 times. September 20th, dawn, 3 Panzer IV tanks attacking simultaneously. Coleman organized 3 PIAT teams, coordinated ambush, let the tanks close to 30 yards, fired all 3 weapons at once, targeting side armor. 2 tanks destroyed, 1 disabled, 4 British casualties during the engagement. Coleman wounded by shrapnel, refused evacuation. September 21st, a self-propelled gun trying to reduce British positions with direct fire. Coleman stalked it through rubble, got within 20 yards, destroyed it with a single shot. September 22nd, another Panzer IV. Coleman was running out of ammunition by now, made the shot count. Clean kill at 40 yards. September 23rd. A building collapsed during German shelling. Coleman was inside. He dug out a wounded soldier while under fire, carried him to safety, then returned to his Piat position and continued fighting. September 24th, his 5th tank, a Panzer IV that got too close to British lines. Coleman destroyed it at point-blank range, 25 yards. The explosion threw debris back onto his position. September 25th. The final action, a Tiger II, the newest and heaviest German tank, approached Coleman's position. This variant had frontal armor of 180 millimeters. The Piat had no chance of penetrating it from the front, but Coleman did not aim for the front. He directed his team to target the tracks at 20 yards. The Tiger II could not maneuver on the narrow street. It had to come straight at them. They waited until it was impossibly close, then fired at the right track assembly. The track broke. The Tiger II was immobilized. The crew, knowing they were trapped in a disabled tank surrounded by enemy infantry, abandoned it. 6 armored vehicles destroyed or disabled in 9 days. The Battle of Arnhem ended on September 26th. The British were forced to withdraw. Operation Market Garden had failed, but Coleman's actions had allowed his unit to hold their position far longer than should have been possible. His leadership and courage under impossible odds saved lives. The citation for his Victoria Cross, awarded in February 1945, read, "Major Coleman displayed extraordinary courage and leadership throughout the Battle of Arnhem. Despite being wounded multiple times, he personally destroyed or disabled 6 enemy armored vehicles using the Piat anti-tank weapon, inspiring his men to continue resistance against overwhelming odds. His actions directly contributed to the defense of the Arnhem perimeter and allowed Allied forces to withdraw with minimal casualties." 6 Victoria Crosses were awarded for actions involving the Piat during the war. Coleman's was one of them. When he learned about the award, Coleman did something unusual. He wrote a letter, not to his family, not to his commanding officer, to Nathan Sterling Blake. The letter was delivered through MD1 channels in March 1945. "Lieutenant Colonel Blake, I understand you originated the spigot principle used in the PIAT weapon. At Arnhem, that weapon saved my life and the lives of my men multiple times. The engineering team refined your concept, but the fundamental idea that a simple steel rod could replace expensive barrel manufacturing and still deliver effective anti-tank capability, that idea was yours. 6 times I faced German armor with your invention. 6 times I survived. Every man in my unit who came home from Arnhem owes part of that debt to you. I hope this recognition finds you well, and I hope you understand the profound impact your work had on those of us who carried it into battle. With deepest respect, Major Robert Hayes Coleman." Blake received the letter in April 1945. Germany was collapsing, the war in Europe was nearly over, and Blake was reading words from a man who had survived the worst combat imaginable using a weapon built on Blake's rejected principle. He read the letter 3 times, then showed it to Margaret. She watched her husband's face as he read, saw something she had not seen in 3 years. Peace. While the PIAT was proving itself on land, Blake's other principle was changing the war at sea. The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest continuous military campaign of World War II. From September 1939 to May 1945, German U-boats attempted to cut Britain's supply lines by sinking merchant shipping. Churchill later called it the only thing that ever really frightened him during the war. If the U-boat succeeded, Britain would starve, the war would be lost. Conventional anti-submarine warfare relied on depth charges, drop them from the stern of the attacking ship, set to explode at a predetermined depth, hope the submarine was nearby when they detonated. The problems were obvious. By the time the ship reached the drop point, the submarine had moved. The ship lost sonar contact during the approach. The depth charges exploded, whether they hit anything or not, wasting ordnance and revealing the attacker's position. Kill rate approximately 4 to 6% per attack. Hedgehog changed everything. 24 Spigot launched projectiles fired ahead of the attacking ship in a spreading pattern, range 250 yards, pattern diameter 100 feet, and critically the projectiles only exploded on direct contact with a submarine hull. No hit meant no explosion. The attacking ship maintained sonar contact throughout the engagement, could adjust approach based on the submarine's evasive maneuvers, could fire multiple patterns until achieving a hit. Kill rate approximately 47% per attack, nearly 10 times better than conventional depth charges. German submarine commanders learned to fear Hedgehog. A captured U-boat commander interviewed in 1944 described the experience. We called it Teufelregen, devil's rain. You could not hear it coming. Sonar could not detect the projectiles. No depth charges detonating revealed their attack pattern. Just sudden impacts on the hull. When the first projectile hit, you knew 7 seconds remained before the others arrived. Not enough time for emergency blow. Not enough time for deep dive. Only time for prayer. A German U-boat manual captured from the sunken U-852 in May 1944 showed how Hedgehog had changed submarine tactics. Allied escort vessels now equipped with forward-throwing weapon system, pattern approximately 30 meters diameter, attack conducted while maintaining sonar contact. Conventional evasion tactics no longer effective. Revised tactics remain at periscope depth, maximum speed, zigzag pattern, attempt to evade sonar detection entirely rather than survive attack. But the most surprising validation came after the war ended. In July 1946, during the technical debriefing of captured German naval engineers, one senior designer made an admission that would have stunned Blake had he known about it at the time. The British Spigot launched anti-submarine weapon represented a solution we had considered but rejected as too simple. We assumed sophisticated guidance systems would be necessary for effective forward-throwing attacks. The British proved us wrong. The simplicity of the Spigot principle, multiple projectiles in a pattern with contact fuses, was embarrassingly elegant. We overcomplicated our own designs while they succeeded with basic engineering. It was a lesson in the value of unconventional thinking. The German engineer was describing Nathan Sterling Blake's core insight, the same insight the British Ordnance Board had rejected 3 times, the same principle that seemed too simple, too crude, too amateurish to professional engineers, and it had worked better than sophisticated alternatives. The ultimate demonstration of Hedgehog's effectiveness came from an American destroyer escort in May 1944. USS England, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Walton Pendleton, sank 6 Japanese submarines in 12 days using the Hedgehog system, I-16 on May 19th, RO-106 on May 22nd, RO-104 on May 23rd, RO-116 on May 24th, RO-108 on May 26th, RO-105 on May 31st, 6 submarines, 12 days. The Japanese submarine force in the Pacific was devastated. American naval intelligence called it the most successful anti-submarine patrol in history. Japanese commanders began avoiding areas where England was known to be operating. Admiral Ernest King, U.S. Chief of Naval Operations, sent a message to the ship: "There will always be an England in the United States Navy." The demonstration of Blake's Spigot principle in the Pacific theater validated the technology's universal application. American, British, and later Soviet navies all adopted variations of the Hedgehog system. Analysis of U-boat losses from 1944 to 1945 showed that 32% were sunk by surface vessels, the majority using Hedgehog-equipped escorts. Aircraft accounted for 47%. Other causes, including mines and accidents, accounted for 21%. Historians later assessed that Hedgehog did not win the Battle of the Atlantic alone, but it gave escort vessels a capability they previously lacked, a capability that turned the tide when Britain needed it most. And it used Nathan Sterling Blake's Spigot principle as its foundation. The principle rejected 3 times, the concept dismissed as too simple, the innovation that seemed amateurish to professional engineers. It had saved thousands of lives at sea, while Blake sat in his London workshop convinced he was a failure. May 8th, 1945, VE Day, victory in Europe. Blake sat at home with his family, listening to the radio broadcasts, Churchill's speech, celebrations in London. The war in Europe was over. Margaret sat beside him. Catherine was home from university. David was in military service training that ended without him seeing combat the war finishing before his deployment. Blake should have felt triumph, relief. His weapons had contributed to victory. The Piat had saved lives. Hedgehog had helped win the Atlantic. His principle had been vindicated, but he felt hollow. You don't look happy, Nathan. Margaret spoke quietly. I am relieved the war is over, but I cannot stop thinking about Hanlon and Wheeler, 2 men who died because of my inadequate weapons. And how many men lived because of your weapons? Coleman and his entire unit at Arnhem, the merchant seamen who survived U-boat attacks because Hedgehog sank the submarines, the infantrymen across Europe who faced German armor with Piats instead of nothing. Blake picked up Coleman's letter from the side table. He had read it dozens of times since receiving it in March. Coleman credits me, but Jefferson made the Piat work. I failed. You created the foundation, Jefferson built on it. Both were necessary. Neither works without the other. Catherine, studying engineering at university, now joined the conversation. Papa, in my engineering courses, they teach us that breakthrough innovations usually require multiple people. The visionary who sees what is possible, the implementer who makes it practical. You were the visionary. That is not a failure. That is the harder part. Blake wanted to believe her, but 3 years of guilt and self-doubt could not be erased by a single conversation. Then, in June 1945, another letter arrived, this one from the Admiralty, from a Royal Navy captain who had commanded a Hedgehog-equipped destroyer escort in the Atlantic. Lieutenant Colonel Blake, I am writing to thank you for the weapon that saved my ship and my crew on multiple occasions. The Hedgehog system, based on your spigot principle, gave us the ability to engage German submarines with effectiveness we never had before. In March 1944, my ship engaged U-415 south of Iceland. Using conventional depth charges, we would have lost contact during our approach. The submarine would have escaped or worse torpedoed us while we were blind. Instead, Hedgehog allowed us to maintain sonar contact throughout our attack. We sank U-415 with the second pattern. 47 German submariners died that day. My crew of 180 lived. I have thought about that trade many times. War forces, terrible mathematics. But I choose my crew's survival, and your weapon made that survival possible. I understand other engineers refined your concept, but the core innovation was yours. I hope you understand how many sailors came home because of your work. Captain William Harrison, HMS Starling. Blake read the letter with shaking hands. 47 Germans dead meant 180 British sailors alive. Multiply that across hundreds of Hedgehog engagements, thousands of lives saved, and the PIAT, Coleman's 6 tanks, but also dozens of other engagements, hundreds. Each one meaning British infantrymen survived encounters with German armor that would have killed them otherwise. Blake showed the letter to Margaret. I have been asking the wrong question. He spoke slowly, working through the realization as he voiced it. I asked whether my weapons worked, whether I succeeded or failed, whether my designs were good enough, but the real question was whether they saved lives. And the answer to that question is yes. Margaret took his hand. You finally understand. It took me long enough. November 1945. Blake attended a ceremony honoring the PIAT's role in the war. Major Coleman was there, now Colonel Coleman. They met for the first time. Coleman recognized Blake from photographs, walked directly to him, extended his hand. Lieutenant Colonel Blake, I hoped you would be here. Your letter meant more to me than you can know, Colonel. I meant every word. That weapon saved my life at Arnhem, saved dozens of lives in my unit. We owe you that debt. I did not make it work. Major Jefferson did that. He refined your concept. There is a difference between refinement and invention. You invented the principle. Without that foundation, nothing else was possible. They stood together for a moment watching the ceremony unfold. Blake saw PIAT weapons on display, photographs of soldiers using them in combat, technical diagrams showing how the spigot principle worked. I spent 30 years doubting myself, Blake said quietly, wondering if the Ordnance Board was right to reject my designs, wondering if I had wasted my life on an impossible dream. And now I understand something I should have realized sooner. Creating the breakthrough is not the same as perfecting the implementation. Both matter. Both are necessary. I did my part. Others did theirs. Together we created something that saved lives. Coleman nodded. That is the truth of it, and you should be proud. Blake finally smiled. I think I am. So could the Blacker Bombard destroy a German tank? Sometimes. Maybe. Under perfect conditions. With exceptional crew and considerable luck. But that was always the wrong question. The right question was whether desperate thinking, unconventional ideas, and a willingness to fail could create something valuable. The answer was yes. The Bombard itself failed completely. It was too heavy, too slow, too dangerous to its own crews. It never fired a shot in its intended role. It killed British soldiers in training and would likely have killed more in combat. By every measure, it was a failure. But that failure enabled success. Jefferson learned from Blake's mistakes and created the Piat. Naval engineers took Blake's anti-submarine concept and created Hedgehog. Both weapons saved thousands of lives. Both helped win the war. Both traced directly to Nathan Sterling Blake's rejected spigot principle. The concrete pedestals installed across southern England in 1941 and 1942 still stand in some places today. Not as many as once existed. Development has claimed some, weather has destroyed others, but a few hundred remain scattered along quiet roads and forgotten fields. They are not monuments to a successful weapon. They are monuments to something more important: the willingness to try, the courage to fail, the persistence to keep working, even when everyone says your idea is impossible. Blake's bombard failed, but his principles succeeded, and sometimes that is enough. Nathan Sterling. Blake died in November 1960, age 73. His obituary mentioned the spigot principle, the Piat, Hedgehog. It called him an inventor whose unconventional thinking changed anti-submarine and anti-tank warfare, though his original designs required significant modification. Blake would have hated that obituary. But it was accurate. He was buried in a quiet cemetery in Sussex. Margaret arranged for the headstone inscription: Nathan Sterling Blake, 1887 to 1960. He showed us the way. Catherine, now a successful engineer herself, stood at her father's grave years later with her own children. Your grandfather spent 30 years working on weapons the military kept rejecting. He mortgaged our home, nearly bankrupted the family, got soldiers killed with inadequate designs, and he never stopped believing his idea would work. Her son asked the obvious question: did it work? Not the way he planned, but his principles saved thousands of lives. Sometimes the path to success goes through failure. Your grandfather understood that even if it took him years to accept it. David Blake's son, who had become a doctor, added his own perspective. Like Papa always said, he wanted to create weapons to save British lives by killing the enemy. In the end, he did save lives, just not exactly how he imagined. The Piat and Hedgehog used his spigot principle. Those weapons worked. That is what matters. A few of those concrete pedestals Blake worried over still exist in England today. You might find one beside a country lane in Sussex, half hidden by hedgerow growth. Another stands near a canal in Wiltshire, weathered concrete with mounting bolts long since rusted away. A third sits in what is now a housing development in Kent, preserved by local historical society as a reminder of when this quiet suburb was a potential battlefield. Most people who see them have no idea what they are. Old fence posts, perhaps. Survey markers from some forgotten construction project. Few realize these platforms once held weapons. Fewer still know those weapons never fired a shot in anger. The summer of 1940 feels distant now. German invasion barges gathering across the channel, Home Guard soldiers with rifles and improvised pikes, concrete pedestals installed every few miles along the southern coast, a primitive catapult that looked like something from the Middle Ages but was supposed to stop modern tanks. It could not. The Blacker bombard failed at its intended purpose as completely as any weapon ever has, but the principle behind it changed warfare anyway. Nathan Sterling Blake spent 30 years being told his spigot mortar concept was impossible. 3 rejections by the Ordnance Board, bankruptcy, family crisis. 2 soldiers dead in training, a weapon that proved inadequate when finally built, and yet his thinking enabled weapons that worked. The PIAT gave British infantry genuine anti-tank capability. Hedgehog helped win the Battle of the Atlantic. Both saved thousands of lives. Both use Blake's rejected principle. Sometimes innovation does not follow a straight line from vision to success. Sometimes it requires failure first, someone willing to try the impossible idea, someone else willing to learn from those failures and try again, a third person willing to refine what the second created. All 3 steps matter. Blake took the first. Jefferson and the naval engineers took the second and third. Together, they created something none could have achieved alone. The story of the Blacker bombard is not really about a weapon that failed. It is about how desperate circumstances force unconventional thinking, how rejection does not mean an idea is wrong, only that the time may not be right, how the willingness to fail can enable others to succeed. It is about understanding that creating the breakthrough and perfecting the implementation are different achievements, both valuable, both necessary. It is about recognizing that sometimes the greatest contribution is showing others the direction to walk, even if you cannot walk it yourself. Nathan Sterling Blake created a principle. Others made it practical. Together, they changed the war. The primitive catapult that could not destroy tanks created the weapons that could, and in the end, that was enough.